Welcome back. You're watching Showdown. Well, reading the Twitter feed, if Craig Emerson wants to have a good night's sleep and not fall into a state of depression, he certainly shouldn't read it. It's pretty scathing. Our next guest, who I spoke to just a short time ago here in Perth, is Matthias Cormann, the West Australian Senator. And we spoke about the issues of the day, of course, but at the end we also spoke about the GST, major issues there in relation to disagreements, perhaps, or the extent to which the federal Libs are going to follow what the state Liberals have to say. Take a look. Matthias Cormann, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
Fair Work Australia have referred the matter to the DPP. What do you think the government should do?
Well, I mean, firstly, the government should ensure that the full report by Fair Work Australia is publicly released. I mean, people across Australia surely deserve to know if one of their federal members of parliament has been referred to the Director of Public Prosecutions. And, of course, Julia Gillard should come out and say to the Australian people whether she has still confidence in Craig Thomson as the member for Dobell.
Well, we're all assuming that he's one of the three unnamed people, but we don't know, of course. But is it really the role of government to interfere in that sense and do that, or should they just keep right out of this and it's the call of the FWA about whether or not they do release names?
Well, there is increasing community suspicion that Fair Work Australia has been out there acting to protect the political interests of the Gillard government. And
do you
of course,
think that?
Well, I mean, there's certainly an increasing suspicion. I mean, the process has been taking way too long. It's been more than 3 years. We're into the fourth year of the investigation. There's been an 1,100-page report prepared and referred to the Director of Public Prosecution, potentially in relation to a federal member of parliament, and people across Australia somehow are expected to just sit back and let it all happen and not be aware of what actually is happening.
Well, look, it has taken too long, but do you really think that is some sort of cover by FWA for the government, or you just think it's just one of those things?
Well, it is time for some openness and some transparency. It is time to let the sun shine in, and of course Julia Gillard should come out and tell us whether she still has full confidence in the member for Dobell, Craig Thomson, and of course the full report of Fair Work Australia should be publicly released. People across Australia deserve to know what has been the conclusion of a process that took way too long.
To the extent that the public may deserve to know some of the detail that's in there, and we're not getting that, whether that's a decision of Fair Work Australia or the government, doesn't Craig Thomson also deserve the presumption of innocence here? I mean, he's basically been slurred by association.
Well, I mean, clearly, I mean, Craig Thomson himself can clarify whether he is, one of the people that has been referred to as the Director of Public Prosecutions. I mean, clearly, I mean, if there is a prosecution being considered now in relation to a federal member of Parliament, then, the public deserves to know.
In relation to the Australian Network tender, now, obviously disclaimer that we're on Sky, I work for Sky, but there's a report in the Australian today on the front page that the government has paid out $2 million plus in compensation to Sky News for the botched tender process. Would the opposition open this back up to tender? Because the government have basically said it's now with the ABC into perpetuity. Would the opposition take another look at that?
Well, I mean, obviously, comments in relation to these matters will be up to our Shadow Minister for Communications, Malcolm Turnbull. But if I can just make this observation, this is just another example of government incompetence. This is another example where deep government dysfunction and division has led to a terrible outcome, a bad process, and of course a botched outcome, with the taxpayer having to pay the bill, the taxpayer having to foot the bill for government incompetence and division. It is highly unsatisfactory. I mean, this is now just one example, of course, of many across government, and this government is so bad, it is really time for this government to go.
The Auditor General's report seemed to be fairly critical of the idea that it was the Communications Minister who also had responsibility for the ABC taking control of the process when it was moved on from DFAT. Now, that's something I agree with. I've editorialised about that before this interview today. But separate to that issue, what about the idea that it's okay for the government to make its call irrespective of what the bureaucrats might recommend? Do you think that this should still stay in the hands of government and cabinet, or do you think that it should be completely removed from government and cabinet decision making so it's not political?
Well, a good government would run a proper tender process with appropriate probity safeguards. But let's be very clear. I mean, this is all about the deep division and dysfunction between Prime Minister Gillard and the then Foreign Minister Kevin Rudd. Julia Gillard did not trust Kevin Rudd. She did not trust the way he was handling the process. That's why there was a decision made to get Stephen Conroy to get involved in the process. That was highly inappropriate the way that was handled. Ultimately, this comes down to we have a government where you had senior ministers either at each other's throats or with knives in each other's backs. They were sort of running for cover, running bad process, and of course ultimately coming up with a botched outcome, which is highly unsatisfactory. And of course the taxpayers are expected yet again to foot the bill for what is ultimately Labor incompetence.
On the carbon tax, Robert McClellan has effectively come out and been critical of Julia Gillard saying one thing before the election and then doing something different afterwards. Would you like to see him as a Liberal MP rather than a Labor MP?
Well, no, what I would like to see is people in the Labor Party listen to Robert McClellan. Robert McClellan is telling the truth.
He's not just an embittered former minister who's been dumped.
Well, the thing is, if you talk to Labor members and senators privately, they will actually tell you that they understand that they have broken one of the most emphatic promises they made in the lead up to the last election. In fact, the most emphatic promise Julia Gillard made in the lead up to the last election. She promised that there will be no carbon tax under a government she leads. And now, of course, we are going to have one on 1 July 2012. And Labor Party people, whatever they say publicly about the implications of the Queensland state election, actually concede privately that people hate the carbon tax. People understand the carbon tax is a bad tax. People understand the carbon tax will push up the cost of everything, is bad for household budgets, is bad for our international competitiveness, will cost jobs, and all of that without doing anything to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. So people across Australia increasingly understand that they're being asked by this government to make a sacrifice which is not going to make a difference to the environment, and that this, of course, was something that Julia Gillard said before the last election would not happen. There's only one reason why she made that promise before the last election, is because she knew that if she had said otherwise, her government was going to be defeated at the poll. So she went to the election promising there would be no carbon tax, knowing that she needed to say that in order to get re-elected. And of course, since then, we've seen a massive breach of faith with the electorate, and she should take it to an election.
All right, we're sitting here in your home state of Western Australia, and there is a GST issue in this state, a big one. Your state colleagues in the Liberal Party strongly are urging, in fact demanding, that the federal Labor government puts a base limit on the amount of GST that their state receives, 75 cents in the dollar. Would you in government, as a Liberal, a West Australian Liberal, push hard to make sure that they achieved what they're asking federal Labor to do, which they won't?
Well, Colin Barnett is a very strong and very effective advocate for the great state of Western Australia. As you know, I'm from Western Australia. I'm a senator for Western Australia. I'm also part of the coalition shadow ministry at a national level, so I've got to take both a state perspective in WA as well as a national perspective. But let me just make this point, and Tony Abbott has been very clear and very explicit about this. The current GST sharing arrangements are unfair to Western Australia, and that is something that will have to be addressed. There is currently a review underway which was initiated by the government, where there is a number of former premiers and other stakeholders that are involved in the review, and that is to report sometime next year, I believe. Now, we will be making some announcements in the lead up to the next election on how we would address this, but fundamentally...
So work has been done, to your knowledge, on this?
Well, we're clearly working our way through it. I mean, Tony Abbott has been on the record as recognising that the current GST sharing arrangements are unfair to Western Australia, and that is something that will need to be addressed. Because, I mean, right now, the share of GST to Western Australia will continue to reduce over the next few years. I mean, to a point, I believe,
ridiculously
where it could go down to 27 cents in a dollar. Now, the truth of the matter is that will undermine the capacity of Western Australia to contribute to our economic growth as a nation moving forward. And clearly, there is an argument that Western Australia, being one of the more productive and one of the more strongly growing parts of our national economy, that it would be in the national interest for Western Australia to continue to grow more strongly, rather than for Western Australia to miss out on resources that can then be invested in infrastructure that helps facilitate that economic growth. But having said
does all of that come back to a situation, though, where the coalition, the federal coalition, in your eyes at least, will do something about this? You say that we'll get some more detail closer to the next election. Is there going to be something in this order of a base limit of, if not 75 cents, near enough to?
I'm not going to preempt a policy announcement here, but let me just say that we recognise that the current GST sharing arrangements are unfair to Western Australia. Obviously, that as you consider change and as you might contemplate making changes to address that, there are implications for other states. So you've got to work your way through that sensibly and through a methodical process. And clearly, to the extent that there are implications for other states, you've got to work with those states in order to come up with a sustainable solution that will be recognised as fair by everyone. But that is something that's underway. But I mean, Colin Barnett, as a very effective and strong Premier for Western Australia, is of course doing the job that he should be doing, and that is advocate the interests of his state and of my state.
But the undeniable reality in this debate about GST carve-up is that there is a certain pot of money that is available. Now, if you say that it's unfair at the moment under the current structure for WA, then that means that if you're going to do something about that, for it to be more than rhetoric, Senator Cormann, it's in a situation where other states are going to get less of that pot of money unless the federal government tops it up.
Well, you got to look at the distortions in the system, and it's a bit like, you know, the potential distortions in the welfare system. If you take from the most productive areas and redistribute to less productive areas, then what you will end up with is a smaller pie to share around than what the situation could be. I mean, I would have thought that it is, if you have a smaller share of a larger pie, that would be better for everyone. Like, so if the national economy can grow more strongly, GST revenue can grow more strongly overall, then you know, states that might have a smaller percentage as a result of addressing this whole issue could actually end up with more.
I see what you mean. So you mean if WA is allowed to develop because of the extra GST revenue, other states may get less GST revenue in that pure carve-up, but then there will be more to go around in terms of other factors like royalties, perhaps, or the revenue from company tax.
Well, and conversely, if Western Australia doesn't have, as a state, adequate resources to invest in infrastructure that can unlock some of the potential that we have, for example, in the Midwest in terms of the iron ore industry there, and so on, then we will have less resources to go around than we could have. I mean, if Western Australia is able to maximise its economic growth potential, then clearly that ultimately will be a benefit to other states through the horizontal fiscal equalisation arrangements, because any increases in royalty revenue, for example, will be shared around the whole country. So the point I'm making here is, I mean, 90% of a smaller cake can be less than 70% of a larger cake, for example. So,
but just to put it in, I mean, just before we end, just to put it in these sort of simple terms, you've said that you think that the current arrangements are unacceptable. That's Tony Abbott's view as well. Does that, by definition, lead to something that has to be done about it? But we're not going to get details yet.
Yeah, something has to be done about it. But clearly, what is to be done about it is, you know, it's got to be based on a recognition that what is happening at the moment is unfair to Western Australia. But what is done into the future has to ultimately be something that is sustainable at a national level as well.
Okay, Senator Cormann, thanks for joining us on Showdown.
Good to be here.